Hello, my name is Serei Jeppesen, and my research interest is on curriculum for culturally displaced Indigenous people. In the general community, colonization is thought of as something that is already over, a piece of history, but theory and statistics show it is ongoing, and its effects are significant. Especially in schools at the provincial and federal level, we see practices that are heavily predicated on colonial mentalities of education. An emphasis on finding one true answer, a focus on data and measurement, a position that puts Western culture as the default that others have to compare themselves to, meaning that for all Indigenous students, their education is not at all equal, and in fact, the education process serves to continually remind Indigenous students that they are different or outsiders and need to find a place within the colonial Canadian culture. A notable tangible effect of this policy is that there is a huge gap in the FTE funding for Indigenous schools and different kinds of Indigenous students. A provincial school just a few kilometers away could receive 30% more funding, while Indigenous communities are consistently underfunded. Legislation is mandated and controlled to be inclusive to Indigenous students with things like mandatory FNMI inclusion as part of the teacher quality standards or leadership quality standards. This comes at a cost. Now we have educators who know little to nothing about Indigenous culture delivering the material, which leads to superficial and contradictory situations, like a settler teacher doing a blanket exercise with an on-reserve student. Settler teachers who want to include Indigenous content are unsure of how to do this respectfully and end up minimizing their attempts so that they don't offend someone or go the easy route of serving bannock and stew one day and calling it Indigenous appreciation. This sort of tokenism betrays the real work to create equity for Indigenous students and allows schools to say that they're trying. This arrangement helps systems of exclusion remain in place because everyone feels they've done their part, even if truly they have far more power and potential to make a meaningful change. This comes into direct competition with critical pedagogy when the systems that were intended to be progressive and bring equity don't liberate the learner, but rather keeps them in a position of oppression. Indigenous scholars are showing how colonial mindsets are fully embedded in culture and school. Critical race theory has the research and evidence to show the onslaught against Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. Rebecca Sockbuson's epistemicide is a term developed to bring attention to the intentional destruction and minimization of Indigenous epistemology. Indigenous students are silently shown that their culture is less than, and as this belief takes hold, entire communities weaken and fall apart. They are treated as near mythologies and not legitimate ways of seeing the world, and certainly never shown to be a possibly better way to live in and with the world as a sustainable, respectful, collaborative community, less focused on competition and more focused on wellness. At the same time, there are real movements that fight these powerful destructive forces. Sockbuson's Red Hope speaks to that hope that is still present within Indigenous communities and shows that although colonialism has tried to destroy Indigenous ways of being, it has not fully been successful. There is still time to react, respond, and recover non-European identities that can still fully coexist in the modern world. A new understanding of what learning at school can look like is growing across the educational field. Experiential, active, and social learning, people like Dewey, Prince, and Vygotsky, is gaining legitimacy and increasingly present in practice, but they are already outdated in mindset in many cases. Conley and Clendinen's narrative inquiry challenges typical expectations of research, data, and science. It is a bold and helpful step from outside the Indigenous Academy towards understanding the multiple real, equal, and valid ways of seeing the world. The concept of lived experience and lived curriculum draw on personal history as the driving force for learning, and these theories reject the assimilating features of industrial and traditional methods. A person's own experience can take precedence over a data point of average and standard expectations. Freire's critical pedagogy has united a large group of educators and theorists to challenge the narrative of typical schools. School is a designed experience, and it was designed long ago, at a time where we had different individual and social needs. It is reasonable and not at all revolutionary to say that school should be critically examined as a continual process. School-based education is the main force in shaping a generation's view and knowledge, so it should be well aligned with our society's goals and values. There are several streams of work to rebuild and protect Indigenous ways. In the academic realm, scholars are working to form a renewed sense of Indigenous identity outside the colonial framework and show that the colonial perspective is just one amongst many, the one thrust upon us, but not necessarily one more true than any other. Decolonizing theory rejects the default status of Western empirical views of the world in education. Western knowing is one way of knowing, but it is limited in knowledge. There is no more reason for Indigenous theory to prove itself worthy than Western theory to do the same. The theoretical frameworks that these scholars develop help shed light on the relationships between settler and Indigenous ideologies, with concepts like the fort from Dwayne Donald and the insider-outsider mentality, or settler replacement from Eve Tuck, illustrating how a unique form of colonialism came not only to rule and extract wealth as in other parts of the world, but to replace the local culture with another. The colonizers never really left Canada. Decolonizing pedagogy makes colonial dominance visible and non-default, opening up broader understandings for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Indigenous communities are working to restore the younger generation to traditional cultural values, teaching about local medicine and sacred ecology, revitalizing language, and giving young people hunting and traditional skills so that they will not be lost. A big movement now is land-based education that teaches skills for living off the land alongside math, reading, or science, but in the context of place and in its unique ecology. Teaching in and on the land helps reconnect students to a different understanding of the land as a partner in success instead of a resource for exploitation. Language projects are increasingly common, working to offer local language classes for students and also working to provide teacher training to spread the reach of these programs. Ultimately, all of these efforts are driven by a rejection of the assimilating influence of colonialism and the knowledge that other ways of knowing and being have a valuable place alongside Western practice. Applying decolonization to an education setting makes it necessary to include curriculum theory as a grounding foundation. Alternative and nonlinear understandings of education and learning provide methodology for implementing non-colonial education. Indigenous perspectives on education naturally align with many critical pedagogy themes, a more human curriculum, more emphasis on learning by doing and understanding that nothing is without social contexts. Indigenous teaching has always valued these principles. Now, a convergence of reconciliation and critical pedagogy make a decolonized curriculum possible. We see that colonization has had detrimental effects on Indigenous culture, communities, and individuals. Fortunately, a number of efforts have arisen to combat these effects, and while the outcome is still unknown, the resistance is evident. The problem for many lies in the in-between, those who are Indigenous but too disconnected from one tribe, one land, or one family to know where to return to. They are the children of the residential school survivors and those who were born to foster children who were scooped from their rightful parents. They moved to cities and were assimilated, but that process could not take hold completely. Now they seek to return to an Indigenous identity, but the revitalization programs don't speak to them or outright reject them for not being Indigenous enough, not knowing the protocol, or maybe not having lived on a reserve. For these displaced people, neither colonization nor revitalization speak to their need, and their need is the gap that is identified. As educators, what does a culturally responsive classroom look like for those students? They are far more common than the treaty status Indian, the Inuit, or the classic Métis. They might even go unnoticed because they pass as some generic version of Caucasian. And if we seek equity in education, then this significant group of Canadian students need to be addressed on their own unique terms, with a context and experience that falls into a third category. So we need to develop and look to a curriculum that speaks to the need of the displaced students.